why did the vote matter so much? Well, last year we passed a successor bill to AB 32 that set more aggressive overall climate targets, 40% reductions by 2030, but explicitly SB 32 did not speak to whether cap and trade should be one of the mechanisms for achieving this overall carbon reduction goal. And there was some politics behind that. We'll talk about sort of the perceptions of how cap and trade has been working in a second. But just in terms of procedural comments, the renewal of cap and trade, unlike SB 32, it was broadly thought that it would require a 2/3 vote in California. This has to do with the history of California and legal requirements for passing taxes, going back to Proposition 13. Over the years, we keep redefining what it is that requires a 2/3 vote. And there was a ballot measure that happened during the 2010s that seems to have ratcheted up the legal requirements for a cap and trade program relative to what those requirements were under AB 32. So while there was still some debate going on, I think most observers felt that a 2/3 vote was necessary to at least put it on a pretty solid legal footing, and that's why it was deemed as so important. All right, so it was difficult to get a 2/3 vote, in part because the natural hesitation from people who are worried about the economic consequences of climate regulation, but also from across the spectrum, there have been some criticisms of the cap and trade market. I want to emphasize these are not my criticisms. This is sort of my attempt to capture the tone of the discussion that's been playing out over the last year plus. One of the big sort of ironic criticisms about the cap and trade market is that prices have been too low, that there's not been enough revenue generated from selling allowances. The reason I say that's ironic is basically that's saying that there's just not enough carbon emissions out there to sell the allowances. And in a sense, from a pure cap and trade perspective, it means that we've been reaching our targets at really lower than expected costs. But one consequence of that is that there haven't been as many allowances being sold. If we have time, we can talk about the fact that government revenues in California have been even more volatile than the auction revenues. And that has to do with the role of allocation mechanics, essentially the direct allocations of allowances to industrial entities, utilities, trade exposed entities, and so forth. Those allocations take priority over the California auction revenues. And so when there's a shortfall of need for allowances, essentially the California revenue share is last in line for issuing those allowances, and that has made California's auction revenues even more volatile than the general allowance market. Just to give a sense of how this is fed back into the political discourse, articles like this were not unusual over the last 2 years, where we've had a couple auctions where very few allowances were sold, and basically none of the allowances that would have gone to the state were sold. I mean, this created a sense that the market was not reliable, that there was something that was creating a need for more stable revenue, as this quote from Senate President Kevin De Leon indicates. So the other criticisms that have floated around had to do with not enough reductions happening in disadvantaged communities. And here's where, as Brian mentioned, there were two bills. We'll get to that. There was sometimes a conflation, sometimes a sort of combination of concerns over local pollutants. AB 32, SB 32 does not explicitly address local pollutants. It's a climate change bill. There is language that says we need to consider the impacts on local pollutants. But there was a very long, drawn-out discussion about the implications of cap and trade and of climate regulation writ large on the correlation of local pollutants. And certainly a large and influential group of environmental justice advocates have played an important role in the discussions about trying to advance their concerns on local pollutants, and many of them were strong critics of cap and trade. Part of that local pollution concern fed into the perception that there was too much reliance on offsets. I think that's open for debate about how much we've really relied on offsets to date, but certainly that has been adjusted in the new bill. And there's also been some issues having to do with how we treat the regulation of emissions outside our borders for products, primarily electricity and gasoline, that are brought in, but also a more general set of concerns about how we deal with the leakage question. So that's sort of the backdrop. We needed a 2/3 vote, and there was a combination of concerns on the business side about the potential costs of a tighter, more strict standard, and on the environmental advocacy side about environmental integrity and about local pollution. So the way that a consensus was, or at least a 2/3 majority was constructed, was by devising these two bills, one that addresses specifically local pollution, and the other, AB 398, that we will be discussing, that addresses cap and trade. A lot of us who have been involved view this as a really positive direction, that dealing with local pollution is best done through regulations that address local pollutants, and much less effectively done through regulation that addresses greenhouse gases. So this sort of pairing of two separate regulatory initiatives was a positive development. Both bills passed yesterday. As Brian said, we got a supermajority, and so I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say exactly how this fits, but the general consensus is that it puts it on much more solid legal footing going forward now. All right, so to get to the 398 itself, and what I'm going to do is just highlight some aspects of the market design. There certainly was a lot of wrangling and negotiations over what to do with the revenues generated from the cap and trade market. We're not going to focus on that too much in this discussion. The real key element here is that it extends cap and trade, and really, relative to the types of proposals that have been brought up over the last 6 months to a year, it's quite remarkable how much of the existing program has been retained. And so, although there are some important changes, the general structure of the cap and trade program remains largely as it has been since 2013. So importantly, we've renewed it now to 2030, and allowances that have been in circulation today and will be sold from now through 2020 will be fungible into the post-2021 period. There were some proposals that would not have allowed that. One important change relative to the current program is that it establishes a so-called hard price ceiling. This is a departure from the existing approach for containing allowance prices on the high side. The existing approach uses something called a allowance price containment reserve. This was this cache of 120 million tons of allowances or so that would have been made available only at prices that we could call a price ceiling, but it was a containment price. Some people, myself included, have raised concerns over the years about what would happen if this containment reserve were exhausted, and there was some concern over the potential just uncertainty about what would happen under those circumstances. In principle, there would be no further mechanism to contain allowance prices if that were to happen. Now, the plan would be to have a mechanism that would essentially sell more allowances and make sure that whatever the price ceiling ends up at is a firm price ceiling. There wouldn't be the ambiguity of what would happen if there's a finite number of allowances made available at this price ceiling. What would happen if that finite number were exhausted? So this is a departure from the APCR approach. This picture is from a report I've done with Frank Wallach and Severin Borenstein, looking at extension of the program through 2030, just to give an illustration of how the cap levels, the red line here, line up relative to the black line is a business as usual emissions forecast, and the ranges, which are quite broad, are illustrated by the dashed lines to the right. This is a forecast methodology that we've been using for a while now, trying to forecast out business as usual emissions. And what you can see is we are, although the cap was intentionally set relatively loose beginning in 2013, 2015, it is ratcheting down quite rapidly, and somewhere around 2019, 2020 will cross business as usual projections and then rapidly decline below business as usual. So although there's a perception that the cap hasn't done as much as some might have expected, it's important to remember that that was in part by design, that the cap was started out as a rather loose mechanism and has been ratcheting down over time. And again, what matters is the overall budget now over 18 years of a program, not necessarily the annual caps. All right, so we've got a hard price ceiling. It's not, the level of the hard price ceiling was not set in legislation. I think a lot of us view that as a helpful development that has been kicked over to the Air Resources Board and other regulatory bodies who will now consider the level to set the price ceiling at. Perhaps we can prognosticate on what that might look like. The ARB has their own proposal out there, but right now there's still, this is to be determined, and presumably this would be done in coordination with the other WCI members. Certainly those people working with Canada and California have argued that that's a necessary element of this. Importantly, offsets have also been restricted. The original program allowed offsets up to 8% of any individual compliance obligation. That was limited to 4% through 2025. It ratchets up to 6% after. This is done on a compliance entity by compliance entity basis. So this also overstates really the amount of offsets that are likely to be used. It's not simply take this percentage and multiply by the total cap level, because some smaller entities are unlikely to bother using offsets. It will probably end up at a somewhat lower number, perhaps largely lower number. We'll talk about, there are some elements prioritizing local offsets, some explicit targets for local offsets. There are some, I think, remaining questions about how these types of requirements interact with the Commerce Clause and other legal areas that hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss. But there certainly is a signaling, and there are going to be some committees formed that will try to identify the types of offsets that could be generated and utilized within California. And then lastly, this APCR, the number of allowances that have been used as a price ceiling enforcement mechanism prior to 2020, because there's going to be a hard price ceiling, which in essence creates sort of an unlimited APCR, the finite existing APCR, there's been negotiations over what to do with it. And it's, at least some of it is going to be dedicated to intermediate price steps, referred to as speed bumps, which are levels that are going to be in between the price floor and the price ceiling. There is some ambiguity in my reading of the language about exactly how many go into each of these steps, but it is going to be, I think, somewhere around the range of 50 million tons in each of these steps. That's smaller than some of the original proposals for price for speed bumps, but it will have some effect, less than some of the earlier proposals might have indicated. It's worth reminding everyone that cap and trade is not the only, even the primary mechanism in California for dealing with climate greenhouse gases. This is a picture taken from the Air Resources Board's 2030 scoping plan. I'm not necessarily endorsing these numbers, but it gives a relative qualitative sense. Cap and trade is the blue thatched area at the top. There's a lot of other directed measures, including renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency standards, low carbon fuel standards, and so forth, that are designed to achieve carbon reductions outside of and really independent of the cap and trade price. And to the extent these are effective, then that puts downward pressure on the allowance price. It means the cap is unnecessary. To the extent they're less effective, it puts more pressure on the cap to sort of fill in the shortfall that other directed measures might have left. So what are the implications overall? Well, there are a lot of important details that remain to be resolved, particularly the levels and specifics of these both speed bumps and the price ceilings, the changes to the offset protocols, what this local offset prioritization looks like. These are things that will be sorted out through regulatory processes now. Overall, though, I think it's worth noting most people seem to agree that the next phase is a much more challenging and ambitious target than the current phase. And so while allowance prices have been at the floor, and there seems to almost be a presumption in some circles that they'll just stay at the floor, when we did our projections, we found a much higher probability that by 2030, the demand for allowances would exceed the supply of allowances without much more aggressive abatement, a 40% probability of being at the floor compared to a 90% probability of being at the floor during the earlier period. So although there's still a decent chance that prices will settle at the floor, meaning that the allowance supply will be roughly equal to the allowance demand, there's much higher probabilities that allowances will be in higher demand than that, will end up at the ceiling or at some intermediate point. If you want to see some more details of that, there's a link here to our report that did those forecasts. So I'll end it there and kick it over to further discussion.